There's so much information available on the internet that sometimes it can be hard for people to interpret everything that they get. I'm a firm believer in spending all the time that's necessary in order for patients and their families to fully understand what's going on to make a good decision.
Hi, I'm Max Brantley. On Tuesday, February 13th, the Arkansas Times reports on news in Arkansas and other places as well. Let's start with Washington, because what happens there certainly eventually comes home to roost in Arkansas. Donald Trump yesterday released his budget plan. It will, guess what, increase the deficit by a huge amount despite his promise to do something about the deficit. The interesting thing about this is that it increases the deficit even though it includes enormous cuts in domestic programs, particularly Medicare and Medicaid, two things that Donald Trump said he didn't intend to cut when he campaigned. That was then. He also has big cuts planned in the food stamp program, including an unbelievable food box program in which he'd replace food stamps with a box that people would somehow figure out a way to pick up that included some non-perishable food items, you know, a can of fruit cocktail, maybe a can of Spam, that sort of thing. It's his meanest idea yet. Critics are saying there's some interesting commentary on how little thought that was given to this. He's also announced an infrastructure plan. He's going to spend $1.5 trillion federal money on infrastructure. Well, actually, he's not. He only proposes to spend $200 million, doesn't say where he's going to get that money. Instead, he'd have the states provide an 80% match for these infrastructure projects. Many of them will say they don't think they can do it. And they continue to have a problem in Washington on exactly what the White House knew and when they knew it about Rob Porter, the man who apparently has abused two wives and a former girlfriend and finally was forced to leave the White House because he couldn't get security clearance. And the White House apparently knew about this for months. The timeline shows pretty clearly that they have not been telling the truth, not the chief of staff, not the press spokeswoman, not anybody else, about what went on with Rob Porter. So there you have it, another week in Washington. Closer to home, Governor Asa Hutchinson's proposal yesterday to cut the income tax by, a huge amount for rich people in 2019, maybe a 14% cut in their tax bills, has drawn some criticism from Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families. They say things are going pretty well for Arkansas right now, but this year's budget doesn't do enough to sustain important services, particularly in education and health care, and a big tax cut 2 years from now would make that even harder. Hutchinson's proposal would cut $180 million from taxes. About 10% of the money would come to the benefit of only about 600 people, super rich millionaires, many of whom happen to sit on his campaign finance committee. It's been a slow day today at the legislature, but we're expecting some fireworks of a literal sort. They need to fix the very poorly written law that expanded the ability to take guns onto college campuses. There's a question about whether you can carry a gun into a campus dorm but just not store it there. There's some unhappy gun instructors who don't want to have to teach the new enhanced carry course. The gun advocates in the Senate, Trent Garner particularly, don't want to do anything that will water down their gun bill. There's some sensible sorts that would say, can't we make dorms a little bit safer? Perhaps not in this particular legislature. Eddie Cooper, former Democratic legislator from Melbourne, pleaded guilty in Missouri yesterday to federal charges that he'd taken kickbacks and drawn money for illegal lobbying paid by a nonprofit that wasn't supposed to pay that sort of thing, or campaign contributions, which it always did. All of this centered around millions of dollars paid by the state government to this agency. Cooper eventually went to work for a healthcare concern that provides legitimate services, but did a lot of lobbying, a lot of campaign contributions to get legislation worked out in the way that was most favorable to it. He's the fourth legislator who's now been accused of finding a way to get money for himself out of the General Improvement Fund, the surplus pork barrel that finally was ruled unconstitutional last year. Two others have pleaded guilty, Jake Files and Micah Neal. A fourth, John Woods, is still awaiting trial. He says he did no wrong, but the evidence suggests otherwise. We had an interesting small development today because of questions the Arkansas blog raised. Mike Preston, the Arkansas Economic Development Commission director, amended his annual ethics report. He had an ad on there that he'd spent $10,000 to upgrade to first-class air travel on junkets to Europe and Asia in trade missions with Governor Asa Hutchinson. The state won't pay for first-class tickets, but the Economic Development Foundation will, as well as alcoholic beverages. He had to disclose those. He said it was just an oversight, a misinterpretation of the law previously. And finally, something you might want to read. Ernest Dumas, our columnist, has a column this week I mentioned on ArkansasBlog.com about Gerard Conley. He's a young man who grew up in Cherokee Village. Father, Baptist preacher, was made to go to gay conversion therapy, a terrible experience. He wrote a very highly acclaimed book about it, soon to be a major motion picture with Russell Crowe and Nicole Kidman. Sounds like it's worth watching. It's a touching story and a happy ending with a family that loves their son and a son who's happy with who he is. It's a good story. There are lots of things to resist, however, and I'm going to do my part. You do too. I'm Max Brantley. I'll be back tomorrow.